willing to stand before God and take responsibility for any souls lost because I stopped doing this. We have no record of an answer to that letter. And it continues on when Susanna both had to encourage and prod her son John to accept full-time lay preachers like Thomas Maxfield, or when she wrote one of her last pieces, a challenge of the Calvinism of George Whitefield. Most apparent in Susanna's writings is her self-conscious vocation as a practical theologian, meaning by that term one who focuses particularly on the interpretation of Christian convictions for life in all its dimensions. She passed this sense of vocation on to her son John, commending it in a letter in explicit contrast with her husband, whom she said prefers such technical works as his extensive commentary on the book of Job, a commentary that didn't get published till after his death through the work of his son John. Her letters to her three sons, all training for priesthood, are full of suggested readings in practical theology and ethics, interspersed with guidelines for prayer, and particular guidelines like her rule for what is temperance. Her rule happened to be 2 glasses of wine is fine, 3 is sin, just in case you need a guideline to go by there. Most Methodists aren't aware of that, by the way, that Susanna encouraged up to 2. In this line, it was entirely appropriate, and indeed long overdue, when the Susanna Wesley Centennial Chair in Practical Theology was established here at Perkins in 2014. We can only hope such chairs will be forthcoming at other schools within the Wesleyan family. And once again, it's hard for me to imagine anyone better to step into this chair after the retirement of Evelyn Parker, its first holder, than Rebekah Miles. Like Susanna, Rebekah was born in a parsonage, child of a minister, grandchild of ministers, great-grandchild of ministers. Indeed, she married great-great-grandchild. And like Susanna, Rebekah has embraced her Christian heritage with great appreciation and sympathy, but also with critical discernment and the courage to challenge aspects of that heritage which she finds wanting. Thanks to development over the last 3 centuries, Miles was able to pursue her theological training not only through her father's library, but through academic study, culminating in the PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago. But where Dr. Miles most reminds me of Susanna Wesley is her seemingly inexhaustible energy. With a much smaller family to consume this energy than Susanna had, Dr. Miles has turned it toward a plethora of activities and writings engaging the Christian life in the larger society. And again, I point you to both the brief treatment on the program and her CV that's on the website. Some of Rebekah's energy has been devoted to the first half of what Outler defined as phase 3 of Wesley studies, most specifically work she's working on right now of John Wesley's moral treatises and his writings on domestic life and putting those in context. But Dr. Miles' dominant focus epitomizes and expands the second half of Outler's agenda, drawing upon our careful analysis of the past to turn to and engage the present, with both John and Susanna Wesley as mentors for our way to do this. I look forward to the further fruit of her labor in this regard as she fills the Susanna Wesley chair. And now I look forward to the presentations from our 2 recipients, beginning with Dr. Ted Campbell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maddox. Dr. Maddox and I are brothers in a very strange way. We were both born on the same day of the same year, but he's older than I am. And We got together one time in Durham where Randy and his wife were having a reception for students that were at the Summer Wesley Studies Seminar, and she looked outside and saw my gray Honda Civic Hybrid, and she said, "Is that your car?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Come here, let me show you Randy's car." So we have a picture with the two of us and our gray Honda Civic Hybrid, same year, and so forth. But then Becca, her father grew up in Beaumont, Texas. What could be better than that? And so I feel like we're in the presence of kindred here today. Very glad that you are all here with us. I'm especially happy to be here today and to be installed in the Outler Chair of Wesley Studies at Perkins School of Theology. I express my gratitude to the Texas Annual Conference and that's my annual conference, who raised the funding necessary for the Outler Chair. I honor my mentor, Richard Heitzenrader, who was the first to hold the Outler Chair, and I honor my immediate predecessor in this chair, the late Professor William Abraham. I was a 20-year-old sophomore at Lon Morris College when in February of 1974, a group of pre-ministerial students, we said pre-God students, traveled to Dallas to hear one of Albert Outler's Fondren lectures on theology and the Wesleyan spirit. The lecturer earlier in the morning was a representative of the World Council of Churches who gave a remarkably dull speech on contemporary crises in education. My fellow members of the student Christian movement at Lon Morris decided they could serve God better by going over to a cinema in Snyder Plaza and watching The Exorcist, which had just come out. But because I was the president of the student Christian movement, I alone felt obligated to remain. I remained, and in McFarland Auditorium that morning, I heard Albert Outler's second of 4 scintillating lectures on Wesleyan theology. I was hooked. That's what I want to do when I grow up, I thought. I bought the cassette tapes of his lectures and listened to them over and over driving through the woods of East Texas in my Toyota before I had the Honda Civic Hybrid. My first book was an apology for the United Methodist Church called The Apostolate of United Methodism, and Dr. Outler wrote a very generous preface to it in which he said, "This is clearly a young man's book." It was written when we were in England, but published in the fall of 1979 after we returned to Dallas so that I could enter the graduate program in religious studies here at SMU. During the next year or two, Dale and I visited a Perkins grad and an older friend of ours, Reverend Roland T. Bill Scales. And at Bill's home in Tyler, when we walked in, he was on the phone. He grinned and pointed to the phone and made signals like this. And then we heard him say, "Yes, Bishop, yes, Bishop, yes, Bishop," repeatedly. When the call was over, Bill Scales grinned and again said, "Well, that was Finus," meaning Bishop Finus Crutchfield, "and he wants me to raise $2 million to endow a chair at Perkins School of Theology to honor Dr. Outler." About 3 years later, I was present at a banquet in the ballroom here on campus when Bill Scales represented the Texas Conference to inaugurate the Outler Chair in Wesley Studies, and I thought to myself, that really is what I want to do when I grow up. I cannot tell you how happy I am to be here this day and to be installed in the Outler Chair. John Wesley has been depicted as a man of action, traveling throughout England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, preaching, debating, defending himself from attack by mobs, leading in and attending religious services, writing to popular newspapers and magazines to defend himself and his people called Methodists, advocating for the poor, empowering women to act as exhorters and then as preachers, and calling for the abolition of the slave trade. In fact, that's very much the picture that John Wesley depicted of himself in composing and marketing his serialized publication, The Journal of the Reverend John Wesley, A.M., from the year 1740. But this presentation will show that there was another side of John Wesley hidden from public view that reveals a much more quiet and introspective side to Wesley, a side of Wesley's character scarcely represented in historic depictions of him based on his journal. Could John Wesley be described in contemporary terms as being more introverted than extroverted, focused more consistently on work that he did alone or in intimate company rather than in large groups or conferences of people? One day in John Wesley's life will not prove this, but it will suggest a pattern that I believe can be found consistently through his career. John Wesley's journal was a carefully written and published work, typically written a few years after the events described in it, after he had reflected on what he had chosen and deliberately chosen, of course, the most interesting incidents. To illustrate this, consider the very first sentence of his journal, a catchy line from one of his letters of 1732. Dear Sir, the occasion of my giving you this trouble is of a very extraordinary nature. On Sunday last, I was informed, as no doubt you will be ere long, that my brother and I had killed your son. That's a snappy, interesting introduction to a book. And that's how John Wesley composed the journal. He consistently highlighted active events, typically in large groups of people. Conventional biographies of John Wesley have stuck closely to the script that he set out in writing and marketing his journal. But other sources like his letters and his private diary give a very different picture of John Wesley's daily activities, and they suggest that there was a side of his personality that was not as well known as the activities depicted in the journal. A side of his personality that reveals how he prepared himself through reading and writing, through study and singing and meditation, and that's his own term, leading up to his more adventurous activities like preaching without permission within the parishes of other clergy. What follows examines one day in the life of John Wesley as reflected in his letters, his private diary, and his published journal by considering all these sources simultaneously. The day I will examine is Monday, the 2nd of April, 1739, the day when John Wesley first invaded the parish of another clergyman and preached within the parish without authorization or permission. The diary, the journal, and the letters he composed on this date give us a complex picture of what happened on that day, and it depicts him in a very different light than the swashbuckling action figure depicted in his journal. But let's back up just a little bit. John Wesley was less than 36 years old in early 1739. He had arrived back from his venture to Georgia a year before, where he had been exposed to Moravian leaders, including August Gottlieb Spangenberg. Early in 1739 was less than a year after his Moravian-influenced Aldersgate Street conversion experience of May 1738. Wesley had traveled to Bristol by horse from London on the 3 days between Thursday, the 29th of March, and Saturday, the 31st of March. On the Thursday morning, when he left London for Bristol, he spent time with James Hutton, who had founded the Moravian Fetter Lane Society, and whom Wesley would affectionately call Jemmy, G-E-M-M-Y. Wesley left his gown and cassock in the care of Hutton and wrote back a few days later indicating that he needed them. Hutton would become a Moravian bishop and perhaps the most influential Moravian from England in his period. Now, John Wesley traveled from London to Bristol on horseback by way of Egham and Basingstoke, where he spoke to a small group and spent his first night on the road. This is how Google Maps depicts his travel. You've got to click the little horse signal to get the equestrian route. Not really. From there, he made a side trip to the village of Dummer, that's D-U-M-M-E-R, in Hampshire to visit with an acquaintance from Pembroke College, Oxford, John Hutchings, who, like Hutton, was also on his way to becoming a Moravian. Wesley's thoughts in these days were consumed by two matters: his contacts with English Moravians who, unlike the moderate Moravians he had met in Georgia, were entering a period of grotesque emotionalism accompanying an eccentric insistence that an unconverted person should avoid all the means of grace, including prayer and scripture study. Though Methodist scholars, including Albert Outler, refer to their view as the Moravian position, Moravian historians and leaders have consistently maintained that the English Moravians of this period this period that they called the sifting time did not represent and do not represent historic Moravian teachings. After talking to Hutchings, John Wesley went on towards Bristol, but his horse became tired in the evening of that day, forcing him to walk behind the horse until, quote, a tradesman came and lent him a spare horse, and they both stayed the evening at an inn in Marlborough. His horse was still tired the next morning, Saturday the 29th of March, but he made it to Bristol by 7 p.m. Now, the other matter with which he was consumed in this period was George Whitefield's example of preaching outdoors and without authorization in someone else's parish. His diary indicates that he was staying in Bristol at the home of a Mrs. Greville, who was none other than George Whitefield's sister, Elizabeth Whitefield Greville. She may have been widowed by that time. Her husband had owned a grocery store and a home in Wine Street, where more wine coming up here, where she continued to live. George Whitefield was also staying at her home when John Wesley arrived that Saturday evening, the 31st of March. At 8 p.m. on Sunday morning, the 1st of April, he witnessed George Whitefield preach outdoors and without church authorization. This clearly disturbed John Wesley, who a few years later wrote in his journal, I could scarce reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which he set me an example on Sunday, having been all my life till very lately so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. But not only had Whitefield himself preached in the open air, according to an eyewitness, Whitefield announced on that Sunday evening that John Wesley would preach out of doors the next day. He put him up to it. An early Bristol Methodist named William Webb stated, I went to hear that worthy minister of Jesus Christ, Reverend George Whitefield, at a room in Baldwin Street, where I made sport in company with others too much like myself while hearing the sermon. When it was ended, Mr. Whitefield said there was one coming after him, the latchet of whose shoes he was unworthy to loose. That was the Reverend John Wesley, who was to preach in the brickyard at the farther end of St. Philip's Plain on the following day. The sermon that Webb referred to was not the outdoor preaching on Sunday the 1st that earlier in the day that John Wesley had heard. Webb's account refers to Whitefield speaking at the Baldwin Street Society later that evening. Why would Wesley have been upset by witnessing Whitefield preach in the open air and by Whitefield's announcing that Wesley would preach the next day outdoors? Well, I am convinced that it is not simply that they preached standing outdoors. So far as I know, there was no prohibition against a parish priest giving a sermon outside a church building or anywhere else in his parish for that matter. Many parish events, like the annual beating of the bounds of the parish, involved outdoor speaking. The issue was not whether one stood outdoors or inside. The issue had to do with the lack of church authorization, to put it bluntly, the invasion of the parish of another minister. A priest in the Church of England was formally installed as the spiritual leader in the parish, and as such was given permission or license to preach in that parish. Yes, dissenting Protestants could preach in legally registered preaching houses according to the Toleration Act of 1689. Yes, John Wesley would object to this aspect of canonical or legal Anglican life. But John Wesley was fudging a bit, I think, when he tried to represent the issue as simply preaching outdoors as Jesus had done, field preaching. The issue with church law was not preaching standing outside of a building. The issue was invading the parish of an authorized minister of his own church. This was no small matter. John Wesley knew that preaching within another diocese than his own violated the canons of the First Council of Nicaea, forbidding clergy from operating within the jurisdictions of other bishops. Moreover, unauthorized preaching violated specific canons of the Church of England, according to which preaching was allowed only in cases where the bishop of the diocese had given explicit license or permission for the preaching. It also seemed to be an encroachment on the ministries of the priest installed in the parish and a personal insult to the priest, since it implied that that priest's ministry was deficient. Consistent with this canon, the Bishop of Bristol told John Wesley on August 16th of that year, after hearing more reports of unauthorized preaching, quote, "You have no business here. You are not commissioned to preach in this diocese. Therefore, I advise you to go hence." John Wesley was worried enough about this that he would later question whether the canons of the Church of England, we would say maybe like the disciplines of the United Methodist Church, were in fact legally established. But his claim that the canons lacked appropriate authorization was mistaken. And he knew very well that the canons had consistently functioned in the day-to-day working of the church. Even more important, preaching outside of a church context seemed to violate the provisions of the 1689 Act of Toleration, so foundational for 18th century England. Provisions that allowed for public worship only in Anglican churches and chapels or in formally licensed dissenting places of worship. In this case, the fact that the preaching occurred outdoors was relevant, and bishops were not impressed with John Wesley's claim that as a fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford, he had, by the medieval and Catholic statutes of the college, a right to preach anywhere in England for the extirpation of heresy. The provisions of the Toleration Act, as liberal as they seemed at the time in allowing the worship of Protestant groups, had become a fundamental presupposition of British culture in his time. And he was not ejected from pulpits, as Methodists have said in the past. He was never authorized to take anyone's pulpit in the first place. Try it this Sunday morning at Highland Park. Just walk in and say, "Paul, God has sent me to preach here this morning. You need to get aside." John Wesley noted in his journal that on the evening of that day, April 1st, he began expounding the Sermon on the Mount, which his later reflection in the journal called "one pretty remarkable precedent for field preaching." After this, at about 11 p.m., he presided at the Lord's Supper for about 30 people in the home of a Mr. Deschamps. This in itself violated a canon of the Church of England entitled "Ministers Not to Preach or Administer the Communion in Private Houses." He was privately on his way to violating church law, as he would do publicly the next afternoon. He went to bed at 1 a.m., perhaps wondering how he could prepare himself for such a break with precedent and church law. So we get to the day itself. Well, I have a little bit about later. Well, yeah, okay, I skipped those. That's fine. We are at Monday, the 2nd of April, 1739. The answer to how he prepared himself on Monday was not revealed to readers of the journal, but his private diary tells us a great deal about what he did to prepare himself. His diary gives a much more extensive list of events, as you can see in the quotation that I have written out there. In what follows, then, I'm going to consider each of his activities on Monday, 2nd of April, 1739, in chronological order. He began his day at 7 a.m. Those accustomed to thinking of John Wesley as rising at 4 or 5 every day may find this disappointing, though it's worth noting that on the previous evening he had not gone to bed until 1 a.m. The day began with singing, by himself apparently, and necessary talk religious, probably with Mrs. Greville, and maybe George, her brother. He apparently sang by himself as well as with others in his daily devotions. The latter reference shows his consistent practice in these early decades of noting whether his personal conversations were necessary and thus not trifling, as well as religious. One might presume that this earlier conversation was with Whitefield and perhaps also with Whitefield's sister, Mrs. Greville. At 8:45 a.m., he went out to have tea. I've got this a little messed up here. At 8:45, he left to go have tea with an unnamed woman, and again noted religious talk as well as singing and praying, presumably with her in this case. It may be that this is a woman named Mrs. Panu, who was going to be one of 3 women who founded the First Methodist band in Bristol. At 10 a.m. he had, actually I've got this a little mixed up. At 10 he was back home at Mrs. Greville's. He again spoke to George Whitefield, read letters, though in the compressed style of the diary it's not clear if that was with him or Whitefield. At noon he and Whitefield and Mrs. Greville had dinner, that means lunch, like we would say Sunday dinner, right? After prayer, Whitefield left at 1 p.m. So at 1 p.m. he entertained Whitefield, leaving Bristol. 2 p.m. he meditated and writ diary. That's interesting because diary keeping itself consumed some of John Wesley's time each day, and it afforded him a first occasion to consider what was happening in his experience. This period of meditation and diary keeping was only 30 minutes, according to the diary itself. But alone by himself after Whitefield had left, Wesley proceeded to other reflective activities such as letter writing. So at 2:30 p.m., he writ to the brethren, a longish letter addressed to James Hutton and the Fetter Lane Society. This activity seems to have occupied an hour and a half. We can see it as another way of preparing himself. That letter has survived. In it, he recounts his recent activities, very much like his writing in his diaries. And I think that helped to steel him up for his first attempt at open-air preaching. He recounted in the letter some of the events of his travel to Bristol, including his meeting with John Hutchins at Dummer and a conversation with a man and a woman in Newbury about the present possibility of salvation. He also described Whitefield's preaching. On Sunday morning to 6,000 or 7,000 at the Bowling Green, at noon to much the same number at Hannam Mountain, at 5 to, I believe, 30,000 from a little mount on the Rose Green. Body of the letter indicated that he immediately contemplating following Whitefield at that point. Whitefield's example of preaching outdoors, unauthorized by church authorities. He said, "Pray ye, my dear brethren, that some portion of his spirit may be given to your poor weak brother, John Wesley." After a note about the cassock and gown that he had left in London, Wesley wrote again, "Oh, how God is manifested in our brother Whitefield. I have seen none like him, no, not even in Herrnhut." So his letter to Hutton and the Moravian brethren and sisters offered a summary of his dealings over the last 4 days since he had left London, a preliminary reflection on the events he would describe in his journal many years later. Now, although John Wesley's diary for the 2nd of April mentions at 4 p.m. only, quote, "at the glass house, 3,000 or 4,000, his published journal focused almost exclusively only on this particular event. The journal was published in 1742, and this is the one that's very famous, one of the 2 or 3 things about John Wesley most often quoted. Monday the 2nd, at 4 in the afternoon, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining to the city to about 3,000 people. The scripture on which I spoke was this: is it impossible anyone should be ignorant that it is fulfilled in every true minister of Christ? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. This public preaching occurred in a place in Bristol, identified as the Glass House, though the eyewitness who stated that Whitefield had announced Wesley would be preaching on the next day gave the location as in the Brickyard at the farther end of St. Philip's Plain. Now, you can see there is Narrow Plain Street and Broad Plain Street, but those at one time continued that one street. This is a site under construction now called the Glass House. This is Old Bread Street. Here is a historical marker for Wesley's first open-air preaching. Here's another place called Glass Wharf, and then the Bristol main rail station is down there very close by this location. So Wesley's first preaching in the open air, he estimated the crowd at 3,000 or 4,000, and the journal says about 3,000. But the reader should understand that Wesley's estimates of the size of crowds were unscientific and often amounted to what have been called pastoral estimates of a congregation. Attempts at measuring how many human bodies fit into the locations where Wesley actually preached, such as Gwinnett Pit in Cornwall, have raised serious questions about the sizes of crowds to which he reportedly spoke. But whatever the actual size of the crowd, there in Bristol on the 2nd of April, John Wesley made a decisive move in the work of evangelization, a move outside of Anglican church law that was to mark the Wesleyan movement from that time on. Wesley's text from St. Luke 4:18-19 was the text Jesus had chosen when he preached at the synagogue in Nazareth. This reinforced Wesley's intention to preach the good news to the poor by Christ's example. I might want to add a midrash to the effect that by delivering the scroll to Jesus, the synagogue had in fact authorized John Wesley's preaching. But John Wesley understood the gospel lesson as a universal mandate to proclaim the good news, even if it meant denying or defying the rules of the Christian community with which he had identified himself. When he went back 3 years later to write up this account in the journal, he appended to it a long letter he had written in 1734, indicating he could not envision fulfilling God's intentions for himself, either by serving as a parish priest or as a priest in a university. He indicated explicitly that he wanted a larger field of work than either of those would offer him. And he believed that God had intended for his life this larger ministry. Well, that's what he did in that famous incident. Here's a current cartoon book on John and Charles Wesley entitled Submitting to Be More Vile, taken from that particular passage. 6 p.m., he had tea with Mrs. Norman. This is Mrs. John Norman, who lived in St. Philip's Plain with her husband, John. St. Philip's Plain was the very street at the end of which was that brickyard that supposedly was the site of Wesley's preaching on that day, according to William Webb. Seems likely she would have been there for the preaching, then invited Wesley to their home down the street for tea. He could relax just for a while. At 7, he met with the Baldwin Street Society, the other Methodist society in Bristol, the one where Whitefield had spoken the previous evening. After an hour and 45 minutes there, he returned to Mrs. Greville's home, had a meal, and noted he was easy there. Sounds like being with that large group of people had really tired him out, and that new venture, and that it was easier to be with a group of one or two friends. And then he went to bed at 10:45. It was a big day. John Wesley's diary for the 2nd of April, the letter to Hutton, the Fetter Lane Society read on that date, the journal entry reveal a great deal about John Wesley's inner life in this period. How did he actually spend every day of his life, or most of his days? Well, the journal notes 2 activities in larger groups during that day. He preached outdoors and without authorization at 4 p.m., and he spoke to the Baldwin Street Society at 7 p.m. with a little break between them for tea with Mrs. Norman. Those activities account for about 3.5 hours, 2 hours for the preaching at the Glass House or the Brickyard, and about an hour and a half at the Baldwin Street Society. Secondly, he spent part of the day in conversation with individuals. His conversation partners included 3 women with whom he met individually to have tea, in each case, Mrs. Greville, the unidentified woman, perhaps Mrs. Panu, late in the morning, and Mrs. Norman in the afternoon. His only other conversation partner, so far as we can tell, was George Whitefield, with whom he spoke in the morning and at midday. That would account for about 4 hours in private conversations. A significant portion of his day was spent entirely alone in the early morning and in the afternoon from 1 p.m. through 4 p.m., and then in the evening when he was finally easy there. It was in this time that he meditated, sang, prayed, wrote in his diary, read letters, wrote the letter to the Fetter Lane Society. He was awake for 17 hours on April 2nd. Less than 4 of these hours were devoted to activity in large groups, about 23% of the day. 4 or 5 hours were devoted to private conversations or conversations with only 2 other people, if George Whitefield was present for some of Wesley's conversations with his sister. So that's about 26% of his waking day. The remaining 9 of the 17 waking hours were spent, 8 or 9 say, were spent by himself alone, and that obviously amounts to about half of his waking time that day. Was this a representative day for him? I suspect it was not. In fact, I've come to suspect that this day had more time in larger groups than usual because of his Bristol schedule. I suspect that the norm for John Wesley would have been even less time in large groups of people. You can look at his diaries day after day, week after week, year after year, and find this same kind of pattern. Here's one from 1741, writ to Brother Humphreys, Purdy Hutchings, Matthew 7 at 8 a.m. He's starting to focus on one passage of Scripture every day, and he'll just write that down. Writ to Mr. Thorold Webb, 10:30s, working on his journal. 11, writ for the society. 1:30, Mr. Willis's dinner, religious talk. 3:15, at the school with Mr. Vaughn, necessary talk. 3:30, a band. 4, the bands. 5:45, at Sister England's, Brother Humphreys was there, exclamation point. Bang. At Mrs. Deschamps, tea. Revelation 14:13, Sister Elizabeth Davis and Ann Cole were buried. 10:30, at home. Now, as you may know, there's a terrible break of 40 years of missing diaries. We have the journals in that period, but we're missing 4 decades of diaries. Wesley didn't stop keeping them, but they were lost or destroyed after his death. After that long hiatus, we have surviving diaries from 1781. Here's one, prayed, letters, the preacher's necessary business. That sounds like meeting with a group. 8:30, read prayers. 2 Timothy 3:5, bang, communion. 1, at Sister Burgess's dinner, religious talk, prayer, visited, slept. Sleeping at her house? Written notes. The leaders, 3 p.m., the leaders, tea, prayed. 5, Hebrews 7:25, bang. Society, supper, prayer. 9:15, in the coach, probably heading home. 1791, prayed, necessary business, read. 6:30, prayed, T, religious talk. Chase, I guess he's riding in a chase, that's a type of carriage. Read Gustavus Vasa, that's interesting, it was a publicly banned play. With James Rogers, 10:30 at Mr. Belson's religious talk, 12 noon. Isaiah 55:6, but no bang. Dinner at 2, dinner, religious talk, prayer. 4:30 at Mr. Telford's tea, religious talk. 6, necessary talk, religious. 8, supper, religious talk. 9:30, prayed. And this, my friends, was his very last diary entry. He wrote his famous letter to William Wilberforce on the next day, probably the next morning, and he died 7 days later on the 2nd of March, 1791. He kept his strenuous discipline of study and reading and writing and prayer and quiet, intimate conversations up until the very end. 3 issues for contemporary Wesleyan Christians. John Wesley's diary, the lengthy and important letter he wrote that day, and the journal entry for April 2nd raise these issues as I see it. First, to what extent could we describe John Wesley using probably out-of-place contemporary terms like introverted or extroverted? But the reason for asking this is because, as Susan Cain pointed out in her book, Quiet, the Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, 2012, Americans in the early 20th century bought into what Cain calls the extrovert ideal, the image of the extroverted leader epitomized in Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, 1936. What she said tracks easily with David Brooks's sense of a move in roughly the same period from a culture that honored character to a culture that honors personality in at least 2 of his more recent books. Repulsive as the extrovert ideal is to people from outside the United States, I can assure you that after 12 years of service on my annual conference's Board of Ordained Ministry, that United Methodist clergy as well as laity still have a strong penchant for the swashbuckling, action-oriented image of leadership that Dale Carnegie offered and that John Wesley allowed us to envision him in that way by focusing his journal on action-oriented episodes, but I think it's a very misleading image. Susan Cain points out that quieter people, like our Methodist saint Rosa Parks, very often change the world, in her case by pronouncing one word and a 2-letter word at that. But they derive their energy to do so not by public bluster, but by being alone or in, she talks about this at length, small, intimate company, groups of 2 or only 3 people. Frame the question like this: how did John Wesley find energy for his challenging actions? The full run of events on the 2nd of April, 1739, reveals a great deal about that. His diary for that date, the letter he composed on that date, tell us much more about how he prepared himself, how he found energy, than the well-known journal account. He seemed to find his energy from study and reading and writing and prayer and quiet alone or in very small company. Second, can Wesleyan Christians today take John Wesley as a positive example for violating our church's stated positions and its stated rules? The answer from John Wesley, I believe, is yes, but not any old action or opinion differing from one's church, and it's not a free ride. There's a price to pay. John Wesley was intensely aware of the price he would pay for his irregular actions from that day forward. A group of progressive United Methodists called me up a few years ago to ask if John Wesley ever violated the rules of his church. "Oh, yes," I said, and I explained some of my documentation for his violations of the canons of the Church of England. They seemed almost gleeful. "Hooray, John Wesley violated his church's rules." Christ have mercy, I thought. John Wesley violated his church's rules. He might have a sneaky way out, even sneakier than claiming without historical justification that the Anglican canons had not been appropriately adopted. He might have argued that the questions and the oaths put to a priest at ordination, and they're all in the Book of Common Prayer, did not explicitly mention following the canons, and therefore he could hold himself excused. But even if he did, this isn't going to help United Methodists who want to justify rule breaking by appeal to him, because United Methodist clergy are asked at ordination to swear before God and in the presence of human witnesses explicitly that they will, quote, be loyal to the United Methodist Church, accepting its order, liturgy, doctrine, and discipline. I don't think that in good conscience one could knowingly violate central teachings or practices of our church and imagine that one is keeping that solemn pledge. Yes, it comes down to a judgment as to what constitutes our most central teachings and fundamental practices, and that's where we are now as United Methodists, to be honest. I've made a case elsewhere that the United Methodist discipline is generally clear about what are fundamental teachings and practices, and I have argued that something added to the social principles in 1972 should not be regarded as a fundamental teaching of our church. John Wesley had a keen sense of what was central to being Christian and Anglican, but even if he thought that protecting parish integrity from invasion by traveling preachers was not essential, he was at the same time deeply aware of what his actions of April 2nd would cost him. He knew, and he says this in the letter, that parish invading preaching, in the open air or not, meant that he would relinquish the possibility of being ever installed as a parish priest. There was to be no insurance, no guaranteed appointment for him. The long letter of 1734 that he attached out of chronological sequence to his journal account of March and April 1739 made it very clear that by that time and by that date, April 2nd, he had accepted that risk. By April 2nd, 1739, he was willing to pay the price for his canonical irregularity. Third and finally, should John Wesley's little-known quiet life serve as a precedent for Christian praxis today? The events of April 2nd reveal that John Wesley's busy activities in large groups were typically preceded by the much less exciting, quieter activities of meditation, prayer, reading, writing, and conversation in very small groups. In a strange way, he was responsible for our not knowing this. It was his careful editing of the journal that gave the long-lasting impression that he was simply a man of action, busy from hour to hour, from day to day, like a modern CEO practicing management by walking around. The general minutes of the early Methodist conferences advised Methodist lay preachers to, quote, steadily spend all the morning in study, or at least 5 hours in every 24. And if they objected, but I have no taste for reading, the minutes responded, contract a taste for it by use or return to your trade. This was not a hypothetical recommendation. John Wesley did this day by day, as you can see in his diaries, right up to the week before he died. It was part of the very atmosphere of early Methodism. The cultivation of study, conversation, reflection, reading, and writing that we try to inculcate at a place like Perkins School of Theology is not merely a preparation for Christian ministry. Hopefully, it is instilling a character of consistent study, conversation, reflection, reading, and writing that will guide a Christian leader to their last days, as those habits did for John Wesley. Thank you very much. So, can you blank the screen? Yes, I can do that. Yeah.
Friends, there's another talk to come, but I'm aware we are all in mortal bodies, so let me invite you for a minute to stand and stretch.
Yes.
If any of you need to make way out for restroom, whatever, you can do that. We won't take long. We'll move on to the separate paper, but Call back to order. And now we'll move to our second presenter, Dr. Rebekah Miles. Join me in welcoming her.
What a joy it is to be with you and to see old friends and leaders of our church and just so many people that I've come to love over the years, and also to be here and doing this with Ted, and he's helping me now with my PowerPoint. And thank you, Randy and Craig. Thank you. I am grateful, as I always am, and love these occasions and the way, and am grateful at the honor this is. And see, I was even hesitant to say honor because Methodists are also a little nervous about these sorts of events, right? That is, being lifted up and honored in some way. And I think part of it is because it gives it's a little misleading in a way, because all of our achievements are so rooted in community. You know, Wesleyans talk about, there is no holiness but social holiness. There's really no anything that's not social something, right? It's all social. And I'm aware today, too, of our indebtedness to Perkins and the university, to the wider United Methodist Church, to colleagues and friends, to the Texas Conference who gave both of these, or were a part of the giving of both of these chairs, to all the donors and supporters of Perkins and SMU. So many people go into making what we do possible. I think about Evelyn Parker, my colleague who held this chair previously, and my great respect for her and for her work. And also for Ted Campbell, of course. I was so glad to see this, John Wesley's decision to disobey in the context of his whole life and his larger understanding of prayer and his relationships with other people. It's so tempting to riff on that. That was part of the original plan, but I will stick with my script here. So it seemed fitting to be talking today on this about death and holy dying on this first full day of Rosh Hashanah. The blowing of the shofar calls the faithful to a 10-day period of repentance, of introspection, thinking about one's life, right, leading up to Yom Kippur, opportunity to see one's life in relation to one's death, to be inscribed, we hope, in the book of life, and not the book of death. This talk is one part of a larger project that I began in September of 2017. As it happens, just a few months before I would be sitting at the bedside of my father, singing softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, and holding his hands as he died. And part of this lecture today, I think, and part of this broader work is my own reflection on the deaths that I have seen and grieved, and I know especially on what we've grieved together and personally in COVID and with COVID. Now, part of the lecture today is from a book that's coming out, the Routledge Companion to Christian Ethics, that Steve Long and I edited, and the chapters were all requested, and the book started before the pandemic, but they were all written, and all the copy editing, and then last week the proof pages, all during the pandemic. And it'll be out in December. It's on sale at the moment for $176. I mean, what kind of sale is that? Yeah. But I think this project, and my larger reflections on death have been shaped in many ways by COVID and what we've experienced together. And this is made, personal for us in different ways. I lost an aunt and a cousin, and many friends and clergy colleagues, and some people who survived still have long COVID, are dealing with that. And my husband, who's high risk, got COVID at the beginning of the month, and we spent 2 weeks of this month in the hospital, and we're just, I was going to work on this talk on Saturday, but we were in the emergency room at UT Southwestern, and then yesterday, as I was working on it, we were dealing with things as well. He has long COVID on top of long cancer from childhood cancer, but I think, I know I've been thinking a lot, and I suspect we all have, about the way that this global pandemic, COVID, is going to shape our culture over time, right? We don't really know, but you see people beginning to think, how will this shape us? And I think one of the things is to think about how this will shape our view of death, of holy dying, and how we understand what it means to live a life in relation to our death, right, in preparation for our death. Now, we are not the first. I don't know why I'm pointing there. I should point there. Is my little deal not working? The clicker's not working. Okay. All right, so I'll do it this way. So we're not the first to deal with a global pandemic, right? In the middle of the 14th century, people faced the bubonic plague, what is often called the Black Death, a global pandemic at that time. It decimated large percentage of the population. It spread quickly because of international trade and travel. And there were so many people dying, they couldn't keep up with ordinary practices and rituals of death and burial. That seems familiar. Not enough doctors and nurses to care for them, and many of those doctors and other healthcare folks died alongside with their patients. Too few grave diggers and not enough graves. Bishops consecrated new ground for burial to keep up, and the Pope even consecrated the whole of the Rhone River so that bodies could be disposed of quickly, yet still in consecrated ground. With so many sick, there were not enough priests to offer last rites, to officiate at their services. People were dying without last rites, without spiritual care, without funeral masses, and they were dying suddenly and without sufficient preparation, including the spiritual preparation that people would ordinarily have or often have in those last days. Without priests enough to offer last rites, some bishops took extreme measures. In early 1349, Ralph of Shrewsbury, the Bishop of Bath in Wales, sent a message to the priests in his care, noting that the pestilence had left so many areas, so many dioceses without priests, that he was enjoining them strongly to publicly command all their people that in the absence of a priest at the end of life, you could confess to a layman, or if no man is present, even to a laywoman. That's extreme measures at this point, right? So you also had people dying in isolation, right? They were trying to stay away from the plague and were in their own homes, and households were dying. The mendicant orders of the Dominicans and the Franciscans were particularly hard hit. They had been, for more than 100 years, there had been a lot of preaching in urban areas where many poor were already sort of separated from their broader communities and the small villages from which they came, and they had already been caring for the terminally ill. So it made sense in this time of plague and with all this death, that they would be involved in the care of the dead as they were. And many of them also died. And they faced this sense of responsibility to care for the dead when there weren't enough of them, when they didn't have the resources. So after the plague had passed, they sat down, and I don't know if they sat down or not. They did whatever they did. In any case, they gathered together and they thought, how do we respond to this problem that we have seen, and that is people dying without the resources they need, right? Without enough priests, without the rites of the church, without services. And part of the work that they did led to a series of manuals, or sort of broader conversations about the art of dying and this Ars Moriendi tradition, or the art of dying. And there were a series of manuals that came out. Here are a couple of them. And you even see this Bosch painting is out of that same, right? Very familiar painting out of that same genre. What this is about, there are resources for parishes and for individuals who could afford them, but certainly for the broader communities, about how you die, about the temptations that are faced, about prayer, the prayers that you pray, about the gifts that can be given at the end of life. And these more popular over time. I mean, popular relatively speaking when you have that difficulty distributing books, but in any case, they became popular over time, and other groups picked them up. So this is Erasmus as preparing for death in 1533, and he really focused a lot of his attention on the long preparation for death, right? That our whole life is a preparation for death. I know my daughter is here, and she's used to me saying things like that about death, but that our whole life is, and you see similar themes in Jeremy Taylor's the rule and exercises of holy living and holy dying. Now, the Taylor book is especially important for us as Wesleyans because both Susanna, I think the whole Wesley family probably read it, but we certainly know that several members did. So the Taylor book, the Holy Living came out in 1650. So he was responding to a series of plague outbreaks that had come in the previous years. And then we know that this must have been one of those books in the Susanna Wesley's father's library, because she read it early, early in her life, because she comments about that to her son when they're having a conversation about it. But they had read this and talked, and I'll say in a minute about the influence on them. So impact on the Wesleys. So this is probably an unfamiliar picture to most of you. This is Hagia Susanna that we have Ted Campbell to thank. He had this commissioned, and this is probably on the left, the one that you're more used to, and he gave me a framed version of it that hangs above my desk. And I will say it's lovely to have this chair, in part because Susanna Wesley we didn't believe in saints as pietist Methodists, but if there was a saint, it was probably Susanna Wesley. So my mom had a bust of Susanna Wesley. Now, if my mom had known that she had said 2 glasses of wine were okay, she might not have had that place in the Miles family pantheon that she did. But for Susanna and for the larger Wesleyan tradition, and certainly for many other pietists, this theme that you see in Taylor of living as a preparation for death is huge. Now, there's this letter that I love that was written in 1711 from Susanna to her son Sammy. He ordinarily isn't called Sammy, but in any case, dear Sammy. And evidently Sammy had been in some trouble. He had moved away. He's 19 years old, and he's been in some trouble. So I think those of us who are parents and have grown kids, we've written at some point this letter of, there may have been some issues, et cetera, and what's different about this is, one, it's basically, the whole letter is basically repent, believe in Jesus, be like Jesus. That's basically the theme. But there's also a lot about death in that letter. And she doesn't refer to Taylor's holy dying, but it is that theme, right? Number 3, she says, of her words of advice, remember your death. Think of a person on their deathbed. Think of what they're regretting. Think about what that will be like for you in this short, transient life. Turn and repent, right, and live well towards your death. Lay aside every weight and the sin that doth so easily beset you, right there, all speaking out Scripture. And run with patience and vigor the race which is set before you. Have good courage, eternity is at hand. And we know that John and Susanna had some discussions about Taylor. And Taylor's book was really important for the young John Wesley, so he writes about it. This is later in a plain account of Christian perfection, but he writes in the year 1725, when he was 23, he read Taylor's rules and exercise of holy living and dying. I was exceedingly affected. Instantly, I resolved to dedicate all my life to God, all my thoughts, words, actions, etc. And even though he would shift in some ways how he thought of Taylor over time, Certainly this focus on living in relation to death and dying well remained important throughout the Methodist movement, certainly in his life, but also right in 19th century Methodism, certainly, and to a certain extent today, though not as much. Just as the Black Plague and other challenges of the 14th and 15th century prompted that ars moriendi tradition and literature, so we face challenges too, right in our time. Extraordinary changes in medicine and dying have prompted Christians to rethink and call for a new art of dying tradition, a new tradition of holy dying, and again to reflect, right, theologically on what it means to die. And you can even find websites and different kinds of, broader national and international efforts to reinvigorate this art of dying well. Now, I want to focus on two things in this. One is just some changes in medical technology that have happened within our time and how we view death that are part of this that we need to respond to. And the other, and the one I'll focus on, is COVID. Because I think COVID has really changed our relationship to death just because of it's so much more present to so many of us in recent years. And it offers an opportunity to think about holy dying and also holy living in preparation for our dying. So I'll just say a few things about the first side of this, that is changes in medical technology. So particularly since the 50s and 60s, but even before that, the improvement of medical technology has changed the way people died, has extended life, and I give thanks to God for those things that probably many of us here would not be alive, but for the medical technology that helped us to live. As deaths and the dying moved into hospitals, it wasn't just a change of location, it was also a change of key players, right? The doctors and the medical professionals became more important than you would in the past have had family members and pastors. The focus of attention in some ways has changed at that point to the medical decision. And I know I've been at deathbeds, and you can have those conversations, right? And hospice chaplains often do, but you have to make space for it, right? You have to be intentional about that in the larger medical context. I also really appreciate the work of Michael Banner, who talks about the way as we have extended life, we also have extended what he calls the long dwindling. That is, we have people living longer with reduced capacities in some ways. And this is especially true for wealthier people in wealthier countries, right? This is not as true because a lot of these new technologies are available in wealthier nations and also are available to the wealthier people in those nations. And that's so that this long dwindling is that so many face right now is also a factor that we need to deal with. A lot of people have talked about that death becoming taboo, as death is moved into medical facilities and as the dead are taken care of in funeral homes, people have less connection with the dead and with dead bodies. You have folks talking about death, that this is the new pornography, right? That we don't talk about death. As sex becomes something we talk about more openly, death becomes more taboo. And there are many changes like that, though, in relation to medical technologies. But again, I want to focus more on COVID. So the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated some of these changes, right? Further medicalizing death and dying in some ways. In many cases, further distancing family and communities, both from the dying process and from the dying persons themselves. Now, I have a few slides here, and these are kinds of generic slides. I thought about getting some of those slides that we saw pictures of, right, and that are probably burned in my memory and yours of people dying without family and friends there, with an iPad with family members saying goodbye, and a nurse, kindly holding that up, with people dying alone, with people, isolated in the pandemic. And of course, part of that has been also isolating religion in some ways, or religious rituals from these practices. And the end, people are more likely to die not only without their families, but also without religious leaders there with them. That was limited as well. And of course, funerals and memorial services, the way we normally grieve, that was also cut short or changed. And I know, I think about the people that I know, and I'm sure you do as well, just all that was lost in not having that opportunity to be present and to grieve together within the context of our broader religious communities, with our families and our friends. So in many ways, COVID furthered some of the issues that we were already facing, right? Increasing medicalization and secularization of death. But it also, in some ways, exacerbated the long dwindling, right? Because with long COVID, you also have this longer period of difficulty, right? What he would call the long dwindling. And on the other hand, it also changed some things, right? On the one hand, it also exacerbated and furthered some things, but it also changed some things. If death was ever taboo, COVID changed that for us, right? If we could ever think we're not and push that away, right, that this does not apply to us, it is harder with COVID to do that. It's harder to be in denial of death. And of course, COVID also highlighted the inequities that already existed among us. If you look at the numbers of excess deaths in the U.S., what are we up to? I think this morning it was like 85,000, something like that. In the U.S., you had about 20% more for excess deaths, that is, than you would have in that period of time. In many places around the world, it's 4 and 5 times as many. Whatever the COVID deaths are, it's much more, because they didn't have the medical capacity to take care. The numbers, and just the reality of this difficulty, and also the isolation that people have had, has radically changed in some ways how we die and how we are present to others in our dying. And I suspect that over time, churches and other religious institutions will have to come in some ways to grips with that and what that means. I don't know, for pastors, when people are used to doing their own funerals by Zoom, what do you do when people have improvisationally set up their own Zoom funerals? How do you re-engage people in that process? How do you re-engage people in the process of dying and the process? Heck, how do you even get them to church, right? I mean, that's the other things that pastors face. What do we do with a wider culture that is becoming more and more aware of its mortality? And I want to say, I'll just skip ahead one and then come back. I worry particularly about the impact on Gen Z. My daughter may be the only Gen Z person in here. I'm not sure. There might be another. I don't know. In any case, sorry, Catherine, one more time that her pastor mother has called her out in the middle of of all the groups that say, when you ask, how has COVID impacted your life? This group is, or at least these are folks that were born between 97 and 12. And they're by far the most likely to say that COVID has had a very harmful, a significantly harmful and damaging effect on their lives. Some people even talked about the Gen Z in relation to COVID as the sacrificed generation, that we protected other people and maybe not that generation. It's also a generation that does not have a lot of hope. So there's a lot of despair, not only around just the ordinary mental health issues, but also with concerns and fear about global warming. So there was this international poll of Gen Z, young adults, and they asked what were the most important issues that were facing the world. Global warming was first. Pollution was second. I think that sounds like, right? Terrorism was third. And the fourth was loss of renewable resources, which also sounds like global warming. And I think there's not only did COVID give to them a sense that death could be imminent, but there was already this great fear of the global effects of climate change and what that will mean for their future. I'll go back to this other. So within this context, it seems to me, now I've got to find where I am in my, this is what happens when you go off script. What happens now then when you have this, much greater awareness of mortality, but you also have the decline of communities and people's participation in communities, the decline of religious rituals. So one of the things that people are concerned about, a lot of grief scholars and psychologists and pastoral caregivers, is this, one of the long-term effects is complicated grief. I know grief is always complicated, but complicated grief is a technical term for people who are, after a year or more, are still really debilitated by their grief, and often is post-traumatic stress disorder and other sort of mental health issues that come over time. And the very things that would normally help people have healthy grief, right? Being able to say goodbye to the dying, right? Being able to gather with friends and family to remember the dead and to mark that occasion with the rituals of the church, right? With religious rituals, with family rituals, that those were lost. So we've got a crisis, right, on our hands, and we don't even know what the crisis is, which may be the case often, right? We know we have a crisis, but we're not sure exactly. And I think, part for me of how do we respond is how do we respond theologically? There's no clock here anymore. How much time do I have? I'm trying to do 30, so we have time to talk. Somebody know when I started? What's that? Okay, good. All right. I wanted to leave enough time to talk. So how do we as religious leaders begin to respond to this, right? Especially given the realities of the decline of community, decline of religious rituals, increase in trauma and difficulty and mental health problems. There's a fellow named Jeffrey Bishop who writes about, he's a physician and a professor, but he also writes a lot about death. And in one of his best-known books, he closes the book with this question: can theology save medicine? I think the answer is clearly probably not, but his answer is maybe so, right? Maybe theology can save medicine. Maybe theology can provide some sort of framework in which to understand what is going on in our society and how we might respond to death. So I want to just talk a little bit about a couple of things that you might be able to draw on that I talk about in this paper for the Routledge Companion. So one of the things I think we can think about in relation to how we die is how we die in relationship to the death of Christ, right? To the self-giving love of Christ. How do we see our deaths? And also that long dwindling that many of us will experience. And by the way, I would like to rename the long dwindling, because when I think of my father-in-law who's still alive in those last years, yes, there's some dwindling, but there's also an incredible growth of faith and really sanctification in those last years. So I don't know, what do we call it? The long sanctifying dwindling? I'm not sure what the best term for it is. That sounds like most of our lives, right? The sanctifying dwindling. So I think one of the things we can do is we can think about our deaths in relation to what it means to be like Christ, right? To give ourselves over as Christ has. And that this can even be a positive thing, right? This framing of death as a part of the Christian journey. Does that make sense? So one of the ways then is to think through this lens of kenosis. So scholars have offered reminders that death, as well as the long dwindling, are opportunities for the imitation of Christ, especially Christ's kenosis and self-giving. It doesn't feel like that when it's happening, right? It feels like something external on us, but this is an opportunity for the imitation of Christ. In death, including those emotional losses, the losses of family, all of the losses that come along with it, the physical losses, the dying can let go as their bodies let go. And this human acceptance of death isn't just loss. I know it often seems it is, and maybe sometimes it is just loss, but it also can be a part of our life in Christ and an avenue for new life and new creation. Christ took on death, making death, potentially in any case, an avenue to participate in Christ and to be a part of God's saving work. Christ offers us an alternative use of death. Physician and death scholar Daniel Henshaw writes about kenosis in relation to hospice care. He says, we need a shift in perspective so that the focus of Christian dying, that's 30 minutes. Is that right? Okay, well, I'm going to skip through. I didn't realize I'm so close to the end. All right, so he talks about the way that we need to think about our dying as an imitation of Christ, right? Yes, it's given to us. Yes, it's not something we choose, but it also can be something that we participate in as a participation in Christ. And I'll skip over this next couple of parts. It's too bad to skip over kenosis. One of the things that Henshaw talks about is the importance of hope in dying. And there's a quotation he talks about what it means to now to die in a, as he says, for many people, in a landscape without signposts. That we're dying, many people are dying in a landscape without signposts. That is, when my parents died, they had lots of signposts. Right? That larger Christian tradition out of which they understand. And when I experienced their deaths, I had that broader Christian tradition. And I know my Jewish nephews and sister and brother-in-law, they had this broader Jewish tradition out of which they were working. What happens when people don't have those broader, larger signposts that help them through the process of death? So one of the things that it's talked about a lot in relation to this is the virtue of hope. So one of the things I really appreciate about the Ars Moriendi tradition, this art of dying tradition, is the focus that becomes not just on the last of life, but on what we do to prepare over time. And one of the things that's talked about in some of the recent work on how to renew the Ars Moriendi tradition is what does it mean to grow in hope over one's life? How does one develop and train in the virtue of hope in one's life? In a way that one can die in hope, that one can face the deaths of those we love in hope, that one can face a global pandemic in hope, and not in a way that's Pollyanna-ish, and not about optimism, right? Not about making light of everything, but about a deep hope in the God that gives us hope, in the communities that persist, right? In the ways that we can together face what comes to us. I was doing a presentation the other night and on this topic in this paper, and one of my colleagues, I don't know, maybe it was Steve, I'm not sure, maybe it was Sylvester back there, someone said, what is the ground of your hope? What is the ground of your hope? As we prepare for death, right? As we prepare for death, as we watch others around us die, what is the ground of our hope? And of course, our hope, right, is in the God who loves us and sustains us. But our hope is also made possible through the liturgies by which we learn to hope, in those traditions and stories, right, that trained us in hope. And one of the things that worries me is that with the decline of religious communities, with COVID and before, is you don't have those training grounds in hope that allow us to face the difficulties, the real difficulties of life. So I guess the question I want to pose to you is, what are we going to do going forward? And that's why I set my timer so we could have a little time to talk. We don't have time to talk? Oh, shoot, fire. That is so sad. Okay. So one of the things that I would like to know from you is, how are we going to die and prepare for death going forward? How are we going to respond to this Generation Z that doesn't see hope in the future? And they don't see hope in the future because we've screwed things up, right? I mean, there's reason for them not to have hope. There's reason for them not to have hope. How are we going to provide We can't provide hope, but we can provide narratives and liturgies and communities where hope can be trained over time. And people's lives can be transformed, and not only that, their deaths can be transformed as well. Thank you.
Friends, while there's not time for the give and take of questions and answers in this particular setting, we're going to be moving from here over to the Blue Room in the library, the Bridwell Library, where we'll have the formal installation. You'll actually get to see the chairs that are the chairs that they get. And as we're moving over, feel free to visit with our speakers. And I'm sure both of them would love to continue the conversation in any way that you can. So let us now convene over to the Blue Room.